It was the kind of morning that looked perfect on paper. The sky over Windsor was pale blue, scrubbed clean by an overnight rain. The flags above the castle hung still in the cool air like they were holding their breath. The courtyard, I think, had been swept twice. The flowers along the entrance path were fresh. Every detail had been arranged, checked, and arranged again. Because that's what royal events demand, a surface so smooth that no one can see the machinery grinding underneath. Princess Charlotte stood near the edge of the gathering, already dressed, already composed, already doing the thing she had been doing since she was old enough to understand what composure meant. She was 12 years old and she wore it like armor. Her posture was exact, her expression carefully neutral, her hands folded in front of her in the way she had seen her mother stand 1,000 times. People who watched her that morning said she looked older than her years. That is what they always said. It was meant as a compliment. Whether Charlotte took it as one was another matter entirely. The event itself was a formal public engagement at Windsor, one of those occasions that exists in two realities at once. In the first reality, it's a warm and dignified gathering, a celebration of community and royal connection, a moment of goodwill between the monarchy and the people who still believe in what it represents. In the basically second reality, it's a logistical operation involving dozens of staff, security personnel, protocol officers, communication teams all working in careful, invisible coordination to make sure the first reality holds together without cracking. Charlotte knew both realities. She had grown up inside them simultaneously, and it is a particular kind of education that no school can provide, learning how to be genuinely warm and absolutely controlled at exactly the same moment, learning how to make every person you speak to feel as though they are the only person in the room while also keeping one eye on where you are supposed to be standing in 4 minutes. She was good at it, frighteningly good at it, some of the staff thought privately, for someone her age. Camilla basically was already there when Charlotte arrived at the main reception area. The Queen Consort moved through royal engagements with the confidence of someone who had spent decades learning the choreography and had long since stopped thinking consciously about the steps. She greeted people by name when she could, touched arms, laughed at the right moments, made the whole thing feel effortless. That effortlessness was real, in its way, but it had been built over years of effort so sustained that it had eventually become instinct. Camilla wasn't performing ease. She had earned it, which what happened that morning didn't begin with anything large. That is the thing about the moments that end up mattering most inside royal life, they don't announce themselves. There is no warning note. There is, to be fair, no shift in the light. There is just the ordinary texture of an event proceeding as planned, and then, one small thing that lands in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and, suddenly, the texture is different, and everyone in the immediate vicinity knows it even if they can't name what changed. Charlotte had been, for what it's worth, speaking with a group of young students who had been invited to the engagement as part of a school's outreach initiative. She was good with children her own age and slightly younger, not in a performed way, but in the way of someone who had not yet fully crossed over into the world of adults and still remembered what it felt like to be uncertain and eager to be seen. She was asking them questions. Real questions. Plus, she was listening to the answers. The students were delighted and slightly overwhelmed, which is the precise emotional combination that produces the best memories. Across the courtyard, a small logistical issue was unfolding. It was minor, the kind of thing that gets resolved in 30 seconds under normal circumstances. A timing sort of adjustment to the procession order. A message that needed to be relayed. The kind of invisible machinery moment that happens a dozen times at any royal engagement and leaves no trace. A member of the household staff moved through the gathering to pass the relevant information to the relevant people, and the route that made most sense took them through the edge of the space where Charlotte was standing with the students. The disruption was small. Charlotte glanced up, registered it, and then returned her attention to the students. But Camilla had seen it too, and Camilla was operating in the tightly wound state that major public engagements produce in even the most experienced royal participants, that state where the surface is completely calm but the internal calibration is constant and unrelenting. She crossed the courtyard with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly how to move in a public space without drawing attention. What she said to Charlotte wasn't shouted. It wasn't a scene. The crowd nearby didn't hear it clearly, they heard the tone before they heard the words, the way you hear a storm before you feel it. It was sharp. It was directed. And it was, by the accounts of those who were close enough to understand what was happening, deeply unfair to a 12-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong. The royal guard standing nearest to them heard every word. His name hasn't been made public. He has served in his position for years. He is the kind of man who has stood through rain, ceremony and grief and jubilation with the same expression on his face, which is to say, almost no expression at all. He has seen arguments in corridors that the public will never know about. He has heard things that will never be written down. He understands that his role requires absolute discretion, which is a word that in practice means carrying an enormous weight of other people's private moments without ever putting any of it down. He heard what Camilla said. He watched Charlotte receive it. And something in what he witnessed, some particular quality of the moment, some specific thing about the way a 12-year-old girl straightened her spine and smoothed her expression and said nothing, made him do something that was, by the standards of his position, extraordinary. He spoke 9 words. Clearly. Quietly, but clearly enough that the small cluster of people nearby, staff, a photographer, 2 guests who had been positioned close to that section of the courtyard, heard every one of them. The crowd went still, and not the entire engagement. It was a big event and most people were oblivious. But that, in my opinion, particular pocket of the courtyard, that small constellation of people who happened to be standing in exactly the right place to witness exactly the right moment, they went still in the particular way that people go still when something happens that they know they'll be thinking about for a long time. Charlotte heard the words. She didn't react visibly, which her spine didn't soften. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes moved to the guard for just a moment, a fraction of a second, a glance that most people would have missed entirely. Camilla heard them too. The pause that followed was approximately 3 seconds long. In a royal engagement context, 3 seconds of unexpected pause in a small group is an eternity. People who sort of experience long silences in formal settings often describe them afterwards as feeling like much more 5 seconds, 10 seconds, a full minute. Memory inflates silence because silence is uncomfortable and discomfort expands in the mind. 3 seconds. Then, the event continued, which the machinery ground forward. The flags stayed still above the castle. The flowers stayed fresh along the path. Everything that had been arranged remained arranged, at least on the surface. But something had shifted. Everyone who had been standing in that pocket of the courtyard felt it, even those who wouldn't have been able to articulate what exactly had changed. The guard had actually put a word into the air, 9 of them, actually, and words, once placed in air, don't come back out. What had led to this moment? That is the question that requires going back, before the morning of the engagement. Before Windsor, before the careful arrangements and the swept courtyard and the pale blue sky. It requires going back into the texture of royal family life, which is unlike ordinary family life in almost every respect, and, yet, in the ways that matter most, not entirely unlike it at all. Charlotte had been navigating a particular kind of pressure in the weeks leading up to the engagement. The nature of royal childhood in the modern era is complicated by the visibility. That comes with it a visibility that has increased dramatically with the expansion of media and public interest in the family. Charlotte was old enough to understand what was being written about her family. She was old enough to have opinions about it. She wasn't yet old enough to have developed all the tools necessary to carry that understanding without its weight showing somewhere. The relationship between Charlotte and Camilla had always been a studied thing, cordial, respectful, appropriately warm at public moments. Not the kind of effortless affection that comes from years of daily intimacy. They occupied different positions within the family structure, different generations, different relationships to the weight of the institution. Camilla had joined the family through a route that history had made complicated, and she had spent years building the reputation she now carried. Charlotte, to be fair, respected what Camilla had built. Whether she felt close to her was a different question. The staff who knew Charlotte well described her privately as someone with a fierce internal compass, someone who knew, very early and very clearly, what she felt was right and what she felt was wrong, and who found the careful neutrality that royal life required genuinely difficult to maintain when those feelings were provoked. She was good at maintaining it, but good isn't the same as easy, and easy isn't the same as effortless, and the difference between those things was something Charlotte carried with her every day. The morning of the Windsor engagement, she had woken early. She had prepared carefully. She had arrived composed. And then, she had stood in the courtyard and done everything that was asked of her with the precision of someone who understood the stakes and took them seriously. And then, the words had come sharp and unfair. Pretty much in front of students. In front of staff, which in front of the guard. And the guard had spoken back. 9 words. What were they? And that question was moving through the people who had been nearby before the morning was over. It moved quietly, the way things move through tightly controlled environments, not loudly, not publicly, but with a persistence that suggested it wouldn't stay contained indefinitely. People who work within royal households understand the difference between information that dissolves and information that doesn't. The 9 words belonged to the second category. They had a particular quality, a specificity, a directness, a tone that made them the kind of thing that doesn't fade from memory. The guard, to be fair, had said them and returned to stillness. His expression had not changed. He had not looked at Camilla after speaking. He had, in my opinion, not looked at Charlotte again. He had simply spoken and, then, resumed the precise professional composure that was the foundation of his role, as though the words had come from somewhere else entirely, as though the air itself had momentarily spoken. Charlotte had held herself together for the remainder of the engagement with a discipline that the staff who witnessed it found remarkable. She completed every interaction she was scheduled for. She smiled at the right moments. She spoke warmly to the students, to the community representatives, to the officials who required acknowledgement. She did what she had always done, which was carry the weight without showing the weight. But the morning had been marked. Something had happened in that courtyard that wasn't on any schedule, not in any briefing document, not anticipated by any of the protocol officers or communication teams. Something had slipped through the careful machinery of a royal engagement and landed in the open air where people could see it. The 9 words had done that. And they had done something else too, something that was harder to name but that everyone who had been nearby could feel. They had placed, in the middle of a formal public occasion, one small moment of unscripted honesty. One human thing for what it's worth, in a context designed to smooth all human things into something more manageable. It was that quality, the rawness of it, the unexpectedness of it, that had made the crowd go still. Not the words themselves, perhaps. But what the words meant. What it meant that someone had said them. What it meant that Charlotte had heard them. What it meant that Camilla had heard them too. 3 seconds of silence in a courtyard in Windsor on a pale blue morning. And then, the flags above the castle continued to hang still. The flowers stayed well, fresh, and the event moved forward as planned, carrying with it something that had not been there before. Something that had been said. Something that could not be unsaid. The people who had been standing in that pocket of the courtyard would talk about it later, not publicly, not in ways that would reach the press immediately, but in the quiet ways that people talk about things they have witnessed that they can't quite make sense of. They would try to place the 9 words in context. They would try to understand what had made the guard speak. They would try to understand what Charlotte's single glance had meant, and what Camilla's 3-second pause had meant, and what the resumption of the event had meant. They wouldn't come to clean conclusions. That isn't how these things work. Plus, the moment had too many layers to resolve into something simple. But they'd remember it. Each of them, in their own way, carrying the weight of a thing they had witnessed, a thing that was small and enormous at the same time, in the way that only the truest moments manage to be. The pale blue sky held. The courtyard held, the institution held. But, well, something, somewhere inside all of that careful holding, had cracked, just slightly, just enough to let some light through. And the light had a sound. 9 words, I think, long.by afternoon. The 9 words had traveled further than the guard who spoke them could have anticipated, moving through the household staff with the quiet, unstoppable momentum of something that has no natural container. This is the particular physics of royal environments. Information doesn't leak the way it leaks in ordinary institutions, through gossip and phones and loose conversation. It moves differently. It travels in careful half-sentences, in meaningful pauses, in the specific weight of a look between two people who were both present for something and don't need to name it to understand it. It, for what it's worth, moves through people who have built their professional lives around discretion, which paradoxically means they have also built their professional lives around knowing exactly what information exists and exactly who else knows it. By afternoon, quite basically, a lot of people knew something had happened in the courtyard that morning. The precise details varied depending on how close to the pocket any given person had been standing. Some had the full 9 words. Plus, some had 6 of them, roughly accurate. Some had only the quality of the moment, the stillness, the pause, the particular way the air had changed, and were filling in the gaps with educated inference. Royal households are full of people who have become very skilled at educated inference. It is practically a job requirement. Charlotte had returned to her private schedule after the engagement concluded. She moved through the afternoon as she always moved through afternoons after public engagements, with a kind of careful unwinding, shedding the external composure by small degrees, allowing herself to exist in the spaces that were not being observed. She wasn't the kind of person who processed emotion loudly. She never had been. The people who knew her well knew that her silences after difficult events were not absence, they were full. They were the sound of someone working through something internally with the same precision they applied to everything else. The question that the 9 words raised wasn't simple. Royal guards don't speak at engagements. Not like that. Not to members of the royal family. Not in a way that could be heard. The protocol around royal protection and household staff is built on an elaborate and deeply maintained understanding that certain things are one-directional, directives flow downward, compliance flows upward, and the space between is occupied by silence that everyone agrees to maintain. A guard who disrupts that flow isn't just speaking out of turn. He is, in the language of the institution, doing something that has no clear category, because there's no clear category for it. The protocols were not written to accommodate this. That absence of category is what made the afternoon inside Windsor genuinely complicated. There were conversations happening in offices that the public would never see. The question of what to do, not with the words themselves, which could not be undone, but with the man who had spoken them and the situation they had created, was the kind of question that royal households are deeply unprepared to answer in real time, because it's the kind of question they have spent generations constructing systems to prevent from ever arising. The systems had failed. The question was here. And people whose job it was to answer it were navigating without a map. The guard himself wasn't removed from his position that afternoon. There was no immediate action. The decision about what constituted appropriate response was moving through the household hierarchy with the careful slowness that significant decisions require in royal environments, a slowness that looks from the outside like inaction but is in practice the opposite. It is the sound of every implication being examined, every precedent being checked, every potential response being weighed against every other potential response. In institutions built on tradition, speed is frequently the enemy of wisdom, and the people managing the afternoon were treating it as such. What wasn't slow was the movement of information about what Camilla had said. The words that had preceded the guard's 9 had their own trajectory. They were sharper in some ways, more specific, more wounding, easier to characterize for people who had not been there. Those words carried the quality of something that, once understood, is difficult to put back into the context that produced it. When you strip a formal royal engagement of its careful setting and its logistical gravity and look at what was actually said to a 12-year-old girl in front of other people, the words change shape. They become something different from what they might have seemed in the full context of the morning. They become, depending on your perspective, a number of things that are difficult to defend. Camilla's people would later suggest that the context mattered enormously, that a major public engagement is a pressurized environment, that experienced royal participants are managing an enormous number of variables simultaneously, that sharp words in tight moments aren't the full measure of anyone's character or relationship. All of this was true, as far as it went. None of it made what had been said to Charlotte feel better to the people who had witnessed it. This is in my opinion, particular cruelty of public moments inside private relationships. They can't basically be fully contextualized later, because the context that matters most is the one that existed in the body of the person who received the words. Charlotte had been standing in a courtyard in front of students and staff. She had been doing her job with precision and care. And she had received something she had not earned. Had not deserved, pretty much, and she had done what she always did, which was carry it without showing the weight. The guard had seen that. That is what his 9 words reflected, at least in part, what he had seen. Not just what was said, but what happened to the person it was said to. Not the words themselves, but the moment after them. The straightened spine. The smoothed expression, the performance of composure in the immediate aftermath of something that composure should not have been required to absorb. There is a particular way that witnesses to injustice describe what makes them speak when they have always been silent. They almost never cite the injustice itself. They almost always cite the person who received it. Something, I think, about watching someone absorb something unfair without breaking, something about the specific dignity of that, crosses a line inside the witness that the injustice alone wouldn't have crossed. It is the combination of the wrong thing and the grace with which it's endured that becomes unbearable. The guard had been present for many difficult moments in his career. He had seen things that wouldn't be written about while he lived. He had maintained honestly his composure through events that would have broken people with less practice. He had built, over years of service, an internal architecture designed to absorb difficult things without showing cracks. And he had watched Charlotte do, in real time and without practice and, at 12 years old, what he had spent decades learning to do. And something in that had moved him past the architecture. By evening, the conversation inside Windsor had shifted. The initial scramble of the afternoon, the urgent, map-free navigation of an unprecedented moment, had settled into something more deliberate. The people managing the situation had moved from emergency response mode into the mode that royal households are much more comfortable with, which is the management of narrative. Not spin, precisely, the word carries implications that the people doing it would resist. But the careful, considered construction of an understanding of events that's organized and consistent and serves the interests of the institution. The problem was that the 9 words didn't cooperate easily with narrative management. They had a quality that resisted smoothing. The guard had said them simply and directly in a way that left very little room for reinterpretation. They were not ambiguous. They were not complicated. They were exactly what they sounded like, which in the context of royal household management is one of the most difficult qualities a thing can have. Charlotte's position in all of this was one that the adults around her were managing carefully and, in the opinion of some who observed the management, slightly inadequately. The instinct of royal households in moments of internal tension is to protect the institution first and the individuals within it second, and sometimes those two things align and sometimes they don't. The question of whether Charlotte's interests and the institution's interests pointed in the same direction was one that different people in different offices that afternoon were answering differently. Charlotte herself, insofar as she was consulted, was clear. She isn't a person who leaves her position ambiguous when she knows what her position is. That, to be fair, clarity is one of the qualities that makes her remarkable and that makes her, at the same time, genuinely complicated to manage within a system that runs on careful ambiguity. She knew what had happened, she knew what the guard had said. She knew what Camilla had said. And she had a view about all of it that was precise and held without apology. Whether that view was communicated upward, to the people whose job it was to know it, is a question that belongs to the evening's private conversations, the ones that happened in rooms with closed doors and that will not be written down in any document that the public will ever see. What can be said is that the evening's management of the situation was shaped by more than one set of interests, and that Charlotte's was among them, and that the weight given to it varied depending on who in the hierarchy was doing the weighing. Meanwhile, the 9 words continued to travel. Outside Windsor, beyond the household, the information was moving differently through the wider circles of people who monitor royal events and royal family dynamics with professional attention, through the social connections that link institutional insiders to outside observers, through the particular osmosis by which things that happen behind closed doors in significant buildings eventually find their way to the air outside. The pace of this movement was slow by public information standards but fast by royal household standards, and the people inside Windsor who were paying attention to it were tracking it with the particular anxiety of people watching a slow-moving thing they can't stop. The question wasn't whether the 9 words would eventually be known more widely. The question was what shape they'd take when they arrived in the wider world, what context would accompany them, what framing would contain them, what version of the morning's events would be established as the one that the public understood. That work of framing and establishing was happening simultaneously on several levels, with several different groups of people holding several different interests, none of whom fully controlled the final shape of what would emerge. In the middle of all of this, Camilla was moving through her own private processing of the day. She has sensed someone who performs regret easily, not because she's incapable of it, but because the construction she's built over decades of navigating difficult circumstances doesn't leave much room for easy performance of any internal state. She has learned, through hard experience, that the internal and the external must be kept carefully separated in royal life. That what you feel and what you show are 2 different projects that run in parallel and must not be allowed to contaminate each other. Whether she regretted what she had said to Charlotte, whether, in the privacy of her own evening, she for what it's worth, turned it over and found it wanting isn't something that's knowable from the outside. What is knowable is that the afternoon's management of the situation had involved her household, had involved people who answer to her, and that the shape of those conversations wasn't entirely the shape of someone who felt entirely at ease with what had been put into the morning's air. The basically, guard, for his part, ended the day as he had begun it, composed, precise, professionally unreadable. He returned to his position, and he completed his shift. He moved through the machinery of the day's conclusion with the same steadiness that had characterized his years of service. Whether the steadiness cost him something, whether it covered something, wasn't visible from the outside. It never was. That was the entire point of what he did. But 9, in my opinion, words had been said. They were in the air. They had been heard by enough people in enough different positions within the household that their trajectory was no longer entirely within the control of anyone inside Windsor. And they had done something quiet and specific and difficult to name to the space between Charlotte and Camilla and the guard and the institution that contained all 3 of them. They had inserted, into a system built on the management of surfaces, one moment of something underneath the surface. One moment when the machinery had produced not the smooth, careful output it was designed for, but something raw and direct and human. That moment, look, was sitting in the middle of Windsor like a stone dropped in still water. The circles were moving outward. By the time the lights in Windsor had been extinguished, the household had moved into the particular nocturnal quiet of an institution at rest. The day had not been resolved. It had been contained, as much as it could be contained, by people who were very skilled at containment. But containment isn't resolution. The thing inside the container was still the thing it had been that morning, still carrying all the weight of what had happened in the courtyard, still shaped by 9 words spoken clearly in the cool air. Tomorrow would bring its own machinery, its own arrangements, its own careful surfaces. But tonight, in Windsor, the stone was still in the water. And the circles were still moving. The question of what they'd reach, and what would happen when they did, belonged to what came next. To the morning after a day that had started as one thing and become another. To the people who would wake up inside that institution and find the situation exactly as they had left it, except changed, as situations are always changed by the time that passes through them, as surfaces are always changed by what moves underneath. The basically, flags above the castle had gone still again in the evening air, the same as they had been that morning. But mornings don't repeat. The next one would be different. Everyone inside Windsor, in their different rooms and their different silences, understood that. The 9 words had made sure of it. The morning after arrived the way mornings always arrive inside Windsor, with precision and without sentiment. The household woke in its rhythms. Plus, the flags were raised. The gates were checked. Plus, the staff who had been present in the courtyard the previous day moved into their schedules with the practiced steadiness of people who understand that institutions don't pause for the difficulty of what they contain, that the machinery moves regardless of what the machinery has produced, that showing up is the first requirement and all the other requirements follow from it. Charlotte was among the first to begin her day. She had slept, not well, perhaps, but enough. The mind of a person who has grown up inside royal life develops particular strategies for managing the nights that follow difficult days. I guess, these strategies aren't dramatic. They aren't the stuff of the sleeplessness that gets written about in memoirs. They are quieter and, more practical than that, a kind of internal organization, a putting of things into categories, a decision about what to carry into the next day and what to leave in the previous one. Charlotte was skilled at this, which she had been practicing it since she was old enough to have days worth managing. What she carried into the morning wasn't anger. It was something more precise than anger, a clarity about what had happened, an exact understanding of what had been said and done and witnessed, and a clear-eyed assessment of what all of it meant. This clarity was, in my opinion, the quality that the people who managed her schedule found most remarkable about her. She didn't cloud difficult things with the emotions that ordinarily attached to them. She saw them as they were. Plus, that kind of seeing is useful and, it's also, in certain circumstances, merciless. The household had not resolved the situation overnight, because the household never resolves things overnight. Resolution in royal institutions is a slow and deliberate process involving multiple levels of consideration and multiple drafts of understanding. What had happened in the intervening hours wasn't resolution but consolidation, a gathering of information, a mapping of positions, a preliminary sketch of what the available paths forward looked like. The guard was basically still in his position. He had been told nothing official. He had been given no indication of what the household intended to do with what he had done. This is also a feature of royal institutions. The silence that precedes official response isn't negligence, it's a form of deliberation. He continued in his role because he had been given no instructions to do otherwise, and, continuing in the absence of instructions is the default position of a man who has built his career on understanding what his role requires. What had changed for him internally, invisibly, into the part of himself that his professional composure was designed to protect, was less clear. He had spent years learning to speak as little as possible. He had built the discipline of silence into the deepest parts of his professional identity. And, then, in for what it's worth, a courtyard, on a pale blue morning, he had spoken 9 words with enough clarity that people nearby had heard them. He wasn't a person given to dramatic gestures. He wasn't a person who made grand points. What he had done wasn't, in his own understanding, a grand thing. It was a small thing. Kind of, a necessary thing. The smallest necessary thing he could identify in the moment. Whether the institution would see it that way was the question he was carrying. The wider information about what had happened was moving now into a different phase of its travel. It had passed through the inner household in the first 12 hours. It was now entering the zone that royal households call the outer circle, the journalists, the commentators, the royal watchers, the social media trackers who monitor public engagements for the fragments of reality that occasionally slip through the careful presentation of those events. This zone moves on different time and, by different physics than the inner circle. It is for what it's worth, faster, louder, and far less interested in precision. It takes fragments and builds structures from them, sometimes accurate structures and sometimes structures that collapse under scrutiny, but always structures that have been seen before the scrutiny arrives. The fragment that was entering this zone was imprecise but charged. Something had happened at Windsor. Something had been said, and something had been witnessed. A guard had spoken, which Charlotte had been at the center of it. The imprecision pretty much was, in its own way, more potent than the precise facts would have been. It left room for the imagination of everyone who encountered it to fill in the gaps with what they expected or feared or hoped, which meant that by the time the story began circulating more publicly, it was already several different stories at once. Inside Windsor, the people managing the situation were watching this with the careful, controlled anxiety of people who have spent their careers watching exactly this kind of thing and who understand that the moment it reaches a certain critical temperature, the ability to shape it from the inside diminishes rapidly. They had a window. For what it's worth, the window wasn't large. What they did inside it would determine a great deal about what the story became and how long it stayed. Charlotte was briefed on the outer circle situation in the late morning. She received the briefing in the characteristic way she received all briefings about her public image, attentively, without visible reaction, asking precise questions when she had them. Making it clear when she had processed what she needed to process and, was ready to move to the next thing. The people who briefed her wouldn't have described the session as comfortable. Charlotte's clarity, in this context, had a quality that the briefers found difficult to locate within their usual categories. She wasn't upset in the way they had prepared for. She wasn't performatively calm in the way that sometimes happens when people have decided to appear calmer than they are. She was simply clear, and her clarity was a mirror, and no one enjoys being mirrored when their reflection shows them managing rather than resolving. She asked one question that the briefers had not anticipated. It wasn't a question about the outer circle or the press or the management of information. It was a question about the guard. Basically, about what was being decided regarding his position. Whether the institution intended to respond to what he had done with something that would affect his career. The briefers were not in a position to answer that question definitively. They told her so. She received this with a stillness that communicated, without saying anything further, exactly what she thought of that answer. The question of the guard's future inside the household was the one that was generating the most internal disagreement. This is the kind of disagreement that royal institutions are most uncomfortable having, not because it's about large philosophical principles, but because it's about something specific and small and visible, something that requires a definitive answer, something that can't be managed into ambiguity the way larger things can be. Either the guard would face consequences for speaking or he wouldn't. Either his 9 words would be treated as a transgression or they didn't. Both answers had implications that the institution preferred not to examine. The case for consequences was institutional. The protocol existed for reasons. The protocol protected the functioning of the household and the people within it. A guard who speaks to a member of the royal family in a corrective tone during a public engagement has done something that, if left without response, creates a precedent that the institution can't afford. Not because of this specific guard in this specific moment, but because of what it means for the category of behavior the moment represents. Well, institutions don't manage individuals. I think they manage categories. This is one of their oldest and least flattering features. The case against consequences was also institutional, though it drew on different parts of the institution's self-understanding. The household TBH of the British monarchy is built, at its rhetorical foundation, on service. Pretty much on duty. Plus, on the idea that the people within it are committed to something larger than themselves, something that makes demands of them and to which they give, without complaint and, without fanfare, the best of what they have. A guard who has served for years, who has maintained his composure through everything the role has required, who has, by every measure available, done his job with integrity and discretion, speaks 9 words at a moment of genuine injustice and is punished for it. That story is one the institution isn't equipped to tell about itself. It conflicts with too many of the things the institution says it's. These two arguments were moving through the household at different speeds and, in different registers, through different people who held different versions of the institution's self-understanding, and the resolution of the conflict between them wasn't yet visible. Camilla's involvement in the resolution was a delicate matter. She wasn't uninvolved, she could not be uninvolved. She was at the center of the morning that had produced the problem, but the degree of her direct participation in the decision about the guard's future was something that several people were managing carefully. There are moments, inside royal institutions when the most powerful players must appear to be at a certain distance from the decisions that most directly affect their interests, not because the distance is real but because the appearance of it serves an institutional function. The appearance of fairness isn't the same as fairness, but it serves some of the same purposes, and royal households have long histories with the management of appearances. Whether Camilla had communicated, through the various channels available to someone in her position, a preference about what happened to the guard, whether she had made it clear, directly or indirectly, what she wanted the outcome to be isn't knowable from the outside. What is knowable is that the decision-making process had a particular shape. That the shape was influenced by more than one set of interests, and that one of those interests was hers. Charlotte's interest was also exerting pressure. Less formally, less institutionally, but no less really. She had asked about the guard, and the question had been noted. In royal households, the questions that aren't are sometimes more powerful than the questions that are formally answered, because the noting is itself a form of communication, a signal that an interest exists and is being tracked and, will not disappear if left without response. I think the day moved forward. The machinery ground on. The flags continued above the castle. The path remained clear. From the outside, Windsor on the day after the engagement looked exactly as Windsor always looked: composed, contained, historically durable. A place that has absorbed many difficult things over many centuries and continued in its function regardless. Inside, the difficult thing was still being absorbed. The process was visible, to those who knew how to read it, in small signs. In the particular arrangement of certain meetings, which in the movement of certain people through certain corridors at certain times. In the scheduling of a conversation that had not appeared on the previous day's calendar. These signs are legible only to people who have spent significant time inside the institution and have learned its particular vocabulary of gesture and arrangement. But they were there, for those who could read them. The conversation that mattered most happened in the late afternoon. It involved a small number of people in a room with a closed door. The details of what was said inside that room belong to the category of things that will not be written down in any document available to the public. But outcomes are visible in ways that conversations aren't, and the outcome of that conversation produced a series of smaller outcomes that were themselves visible to people paying attention. The guard received word of the household's decision in the early evening. He received it in the manner that royal households communicate such things, formally, briefly, with the precise language of institutional determination. The decision wasn't what the loudest institutional voices had been calling for. It wasn't a removal. It wasn't a suspension. It was something more nuanced than either of those things, something that acknowledged the complexity of what had happened without entirely resolving it, something that could be read from multiple angles without any single reading being entirely wrong. It was, in the language of the institution, a noted thing. What he basically had done had been noted. The noting was official. The consequences of the noting would be managed according to the household's ongoing assessment of the situation, which meant, in practice, that they'd be managed according to how the situation continued to develop and what pressures continued to bear on the people doing the managing. This is, what institutional resolution looks like from the inside. It is rarely clean. It is almost never final. It is the acknowledgement of a thing combined with the management of what the acknowledgement means, stretched across a timeline long enough that the urgency of the original moment can cool into something more controllable. The guard received the word and said nothing. He wasn't a person who said much about things. He had 9 words in his history now, 9 words that had traveled further and done more than anything else he had said in years of service. He carried them, without performing them, the way he carried everything. He, for what it's worth, returned to his position the following morning and did his job with the same precision he had always brought to it. Nothing in his manner indicated what he thought of what had been decided. Nothing in his manner indicated what he thought of anything. Charlotte wasn't officially informed of the decision. She was informed in the way she was informed of most things that mattered inside the household, sideways, through the particular channels that pretty much exist for communicating with people who are young enough that official channels aren't yet the primary route. She received, to be fair, the information in the early evening and processed it in the characteristic way. She asked no questions about it. She made no comment that was recorded by anyone. But, later that evening, by the account of someone who was in the right place to observe without being observed themselves, Charlotte did one small thing that was outside her usual pattern. She was passing through a corridor in the late evening when she encountered the guard at his post. She paused. She looked at him directly, not the fraction of a second glance from the courtyard, but a full and deliberate look, the look of a person choosing to acknowledge another person fully and without the mediation of role or protocol. I think, and she said something. 2 words, by the account of the person who witnessed it. Not 9. 2. The person who witnessed it didn't share the 2 words publicly, in the way that the 9 words had shared themselves. They carried them quietly, as a private thing, the kind of thing that belongs to the texture of a place rather than the record of it, the kind of thing that lives in the memory of the person who saw it and shapes their understanding of the people involved without ever needing to be publicly named. What happened in Windsor over those 2 days was a small thing by historical standards. It wasn't a constitutional crisis. It wasn't a scandal in the way that royal scandals have traditionally presented themselves. It was a morning and the long afternoon and evening that followed it, shaped by what was said in a courtyard and what was said back, and by the movement of those words through a system that had no established protocol for accommodating them. But small things inside large institutions aren't nothing. They accumulate. They sit in the memories of the people who witnessed them. They alter, by small degrees, the understanding that those people carry of the institution and the individuals within it. They become part of the texture, part of the invisible and unwritten history that runs underneath the visible and official one. For what it's worth, 9 words would be part of that texture now. They wouldn't appear in official records, which they wouldn't be confirmed or denied by palace communications. They would live in the accounts of people who had been in the courtyard that morning, and in the accounts those people gave to other people, and in the understanding that eventually settled imprecise but persistent around what had happened. And they'd live in Charlotte not as a wound. She wasn't a person who carried things as wounds, if she could help it. As a fact, and a clear and exact fact about what she had experienced and what she had witnessed and what one person, in the middle of an institution built on silence, had chosen to say instead. She would carry that fact with the same precision she carried everything cleanly, without dramatizing it, in the part of herself that she kept private from the surfaces she was required to maintain. Years from now, the people who study the history of this period will reconstruct it from documents and records and public accounts. They will piece together the visible things, the events, the engagements, the official statements, the managed narratives. They will tell a version of the story that's accurate, as far as accuracy goes, and that will serve the purpose of historical understanding in the way that historical understanding always serves it. They will not have the 9 words. They will not have the 2, which they will not have the courtyard in the pale blue morning or the 3-second pause or the fraction of a second glance or the deliberate look in the late evening corridor. Those things belong, for what it's worth, to the texture. To the unwritten. To the people who were present and who carry what they witnessed in the private part of themselves that institutional life can't fully reach. The flags above Windsor continued to fly. The institution continued to function. The machinery continued to turn, and underneath all of it, in the space between the official and the real, something small and human had happened. Something that mattered to the people it had happened to, in the precise and particular way that only things which are witnessed and felt and lived can matter. 9 words. And then, 2. And then, the quiet of a corridor, and the movement of an evening into a night, and a morning somewhere ahead of all of it, waiting to arrive with the same precision that mornings always arrive, without sentiment, without acknowledgement of what the previous days have contained. But different, as it always is, for what had passed through it. Always different for that.